For decades, the world has looked at Princess Caroline of Monaco and seen only elegance. A woman who never seemed to raise her voice, never seemed to lose her composure, never seemed to let the cameras catch her off guard. She has been called the most poised royal in Europe, a woman built from quiet discipline and old-world grace. But underneath that calm surface sits one of the strangest and saddest love stories in modern royal history. A marriage that technically still exists on paper, to a man whose name has become a fixture in European police blotters. This is the story of how Caroline of Monaco ended up bound, in name only, to a prince with no kingdom, a fierce temper, and a trail of scandal that never seems to end. It begins, as so much of Caroline's life does, with loss. By the time she walked down the aisle for the third time, on her own 42nd birthday, she had already buried her mother and buried her husband. She had already watched her own hair fall out from what friends quietly called years of unrelenting grief. And still, in January of 1999, she chose to believe in one more beginning. She could not have known then how completely that choice would unravel, not into a divorce, not into a clean and public ending, but into something far stranger, a marriage that never technically broke, even as everything inside it did. Long before Caroline was born, whispers followed the Grimaldi family of Monaco, the idea that something old and unlucky clung to the ruling house when it came to love. The legend traces back centuries to a supposed wrong done to a woman by a Grimaldi prince, and the curse she is said to have placed on his descendants in return, that none of them would ever hold on to love for long. Whether or not anyone in the family actually believes it, the 20th century gave the story plenty of fuel. Broken engagements, sudden deaths, and tabloid-ready scandals seemed to trail the Grimaldis generation after generation, and Caroline's own sister, Princess Stephanie, would spend years living out her own chapter of that pattern in the headlines. But it is Caroline whose story carries the heaviest weight. Two losses, in particular, reshaped her entire life and, in many ways, set her on the path toward the troubled marriage that would define her later years. Caroline Louise Marguerite Grimaldi arrived on January 23, 1957, inside the Prince's Palace of Monaco, the first child of Prince Rainier III and his American-born wife, the former film star Grace Kelly. From the outside, her childhood looked like something out of a storybook. She studied in Paris, moved fluently between languages, and by her teenage years had already become one of the most photographed young women on the continent, poised, stylish, and seemingly untouchable. That illusion shattered in September of 1982. On the 13th of that month, Grace Kelly was driving along a steep mountain road in France with her youngest daughter, Stephanie, when she suffered a stroke behind the wheel. The car went over the edge. Grace died from her injuries the next day. She was 52 years old. Stephanie survived but was badly shaken, and cruel, baseless rumors soon circulated suggesting she had somehow caused the crash herself. Rumors that added fresh pain to a family already in mourning. Monaco grieved publicly. Caroline, only 25, grieved privately while being asked to do something enormous. Her father turned to her in the depths of his own sorrow and asked her to step into the role her mother had occupied, to become, in effect, Monaco's First Lady. She would take on Grace's charitable and cultural responsibilities and help hold together a family and a principality that had been knocked sideways by loss. Caroline had been raised to see duty as something close to obligation, and by her own later admission, refusal never really felt like an option. She said yes, and in doing so, she set aside her own 20s to become the emotional center of her father's grieving household. Those close to Rainier said he seemed almost stunned by how completely his daughter filled the space Grace had left, as if some part of his late wife had returned through her. Caroline's romantic life had already taken its first hard hit before her mother's death. In 1978, at just 21, she married Philippe Junot, a Parisian banker 17 years her senior with a reputation for a fast, glamorous lifestyle. Grace Kelly had opposed the match from the start, uneasy about both the age gap and Junot's history, and reportedly told people privately that she didn't expect it to last. She was right. The marriage collapsed within 2 years. Because Caroline was a practicing Catholic, the church didn't formally annul the union until 1992, meaning the shadow of that first failed marriage lingered over her for well over a decade. After her mother's death, something in Caroline's life finally seemed to go right. She fell for Stefano Casiraghi, the son of a wealthy Italian industrial family and a champion offshore powerboat racer. Where Junot had been all flash and scandal, Casiraghi was steady, devoted, and famously hard to find dirt on. Reporters who went looking for skeletons in his past came up empty. Caroline and Stefano married in a small civil ceremony on December 29, 1983, with only a handful of guests present. A church wedding wasn't possible yet, since her first marriage hadn't been annulled, and the couple didn't want to wait. Caroline was already several months pregnant. Their son Andrea arrived in 1984. Their daughter Charlotte followed in 1986, and their son Pierre in 1987. For a few years, Caroline had exactly what the family's old legend supposedly denied its members: a stable home, a devoted husband, and 3 young children growing up largely out of the spotlight's harshest glare. Then, on October 3, 1990, everything collapsed again. Stefano was competing off the coast of Monaco, defending his world championship title in offshore powerboat racing. Earlier in the race, he and his co-pilot had actually paused to help rescue a competitor whose boat had caught fire, a detail that makes what followed feel even crueler. Pushing to make up lost time in rough water, his catamaran flipped violently. He suffered fatal injuries and died at 30 years old. Caroline was in Paris when she got the news. She returned home a widow at 33, with 3 children all under the age of 7. His funeral was held in the same cathedral where her mother's funeral had taken place less than a decade earlier. Caroline's response to that second devastating loss was to disappear. She moved with her children to a rented house in the south of France, seeking distance from the constant scrutiny of Monaco and hoping to give her kids something resembling a normal childhood. For years, one of the most photographed women in the world essentially vanished from public life. Those close to the family later said the seclusion worked, that it helped shape Andrea, Charlotte, and Pierre into grounded adults, and Caroline's brother Albert would go on to praise how she raised them almost entirely on her own. But the toll on Caroline herself became visible when she finally began reappearing in the mid-1990s. The polished style icon the public remembered showed up with her hair cut close to her scalp, much of it clearly gone. She was dealing with alopecia, and the sight triggered a wave of public speculation about her health. Palace officials moved quickly to calm things down, insisting the condition was only skin deep and that her hair would return. Still, many who watched her closely connected the alopecia to years of compounding grief that hadn't fully healed even as she moved through a turbulent, reportedly volatile 5-year relationship with French actor Vincent Lindon, a relationship that occasionally spilled into public view, including one widely noted argument at a Monaco function in 1995. Those who knew Caroline during this period often describe a woman caught between 2 roles that never quite fit together comfortably. On one hand, she was Monaco's public face, dignified, dutiful, present at every state function and charity gala the principality required of her. On the other, she was a private woman trying to grieve a husband she'd lost far too young, trying to raise 3 small children without the partner she'd expected to raise them with, and doing much of that emotional labor without the luxury of stepping fully out of the spotlight. Biographers who have studied her life often point to this stretch, roughly the early to mid-1990s, as one of the loneliest periods of her adult years, even though it came sandwiched between 2 of the most publicly discussed relationships of her life. It was in this fragile stretch of her life, still carrying old wounds, raising 3 children largely alone, that a very different kind of man entered the picture. What followed would become the most talked about, and ultimately the most bewildering, relationship of her life. Ernst August of Hanover carried an impressive resume on paper. Born in 1954, he stood at the head of the historic House of Hanover, a direct male line descendant of Britain's King George III, and held old, resonant titles, including Duke of Brunswick. But those titles came with no actual power. Germany had done away with its monarchies after the First World War. So Ernst August ruled nothing at all. What he had instead was a name, a fortune, and, according to those who knew him, a genuinely explosive temper paired with a taste for excess and a long pattern of infidelity. Since 1981, he had been married to Chantal Hocheley, a Swiss heiress connected to a chocolate manufacturing fortune. The couple had two sons, born in 1983 and 1985, and split their time between homes in Germany and London. For years, by multiple accounts, Chantal had tolerated her husband's wandering eye. What she reportedly hadn't accounted for was who the other woman would eventually turn out to be. One of her own friends, Princess Caroline. By 1996, rumors of an affair between Ernst August and Caroline had grown too loud to ignore, fueled by reports the pair had shared an extravagant hotel stay in Bangkok. Caroline's camp initially denied any romance, framing the trip as cultural rather than personal. That denial didn't survive long. Photographs soon surfaced showing the two kissing in the south of France, and the fallout was immediate. Humiliated, Chantal filed for divorce, and the marriage that had lasted 16 years officially ended in 1997, clearing the way for one of the most controversial royal romances of the decade, one built on the wreckage of a friendship as much as a marriage. The betrayal cut in two directions at once. For Chantal, it meant losing not just a husband but a friend in the same stroke, the kind of double loss that tabloids across Germany and France seized on for months. For Caroline, it meant stepping into a relationship that was, from its very first public moment, defined by scandal rather than romance. Where her courtship with Stefano Casiraghi had been quiet, private, and largely free of controversy, her courtship with Ernst August played out entirely in headlines, paparazzi photographs, and furious denials that kept collapsing under new evidence. Friends of Caroline's later suggested that she had underestimated just how much noise the relationship would generate, and just how long the fallout with Chantal would color the way Europe's royal watchers viewed her new marriage before it had even begun. Despite, or perhaps because of, the controversy surrounding it, the relationship pushed forward. On January 23, 1999, which was also Caroline's 42nd birthday, she and Ernst August married in a civil ceremony inside the Chamber of Mirrors at the Prince's Palace of Monaco. Caroline was roughly 2 months pregnant at the time. Because Ernst August was a legitimate male line descendant of Britain's royal family, the marriage technically required the formal blessing of Queen Elizabeth II under Britain's Old Royal Marriages Act, a formality the Queen, his distant cousin, granted through an official order. As a consequence of Caroline's Catholic faith, Ernst August lost his place in the British line of succession under Britain's historic Act of Settlement. That July, Caroline gave birth to their daughter, Princess Alexandra of Hanover, in the Austrian town of Wackelbruck. For a moment, it genuinely looked as though Caroline had found a new chapter, a title grander than the one she'd been born with, a new baby, and after years of loss, the outward appearance of a second chance. When her father died in 2005 and her brother Albert took the throne, the marriage even briefly placed her as heir presumptive to Monaco, a position she held until Albert's own twins arrived nearly a decade later. But the shine didn't last. The man Caroline had married would spend the following years building a public record that turned the marriage into a source of embarrassment rather than comfort. If Stefano Casiraghi had been nearly impossible to find scandal on, Ernst August seemed to attract it constantly. Around the time of the wedding itself, he was fined for physically attacking a German photographer, an early sign of the temper that would come to define him publicly. Then, in 2000, came the incident that made him infamous across Europe. Photographed urinating on the Turkish pavilion at the Expo World's Fair in Hanover, an act the Turkish embassy formally condemned as an insult to the Turkish people. The image stuck to him for years. Around the same period, he was accused of assaulting a man at his beach property in Kenya, an incident serious enough to trigger legal proceedings and leave the alleged victim hospitalized. Reports of nightclub altercations and aggressive outbursts followed him with grim regularity, and European tabloids began openly calling him the Wild Prince, a nickname he kept earning fresh reasons to deserve. For Caroline, who had spent her adult life cultivating an image built on restraint, privacy, and the quiet dignity associated with her mother, the contrast couldn't have been sharper. She largely kept her feelings out of public view, but behind palace doors, the marriage was already starting to fracture. What made the situation especially difficult for Caroline was the sheer visibility of it all. She had spent years rebuilding her public image after the alopecia scare and the years of seclusion following Stefano's death. carefully re-establishing herself as a figure of composure and reliability. Now every fresh headline about her husband's temper risked dragging her name back into the same tabloid churn she had worked so hard to step away from. Royal commentators of the era often noted the strange asymmetry of the couple, one half building institutions and quietly shouldering charitable work, the other generating international incidents that embassies felt compelled to respond to. It was, even by the standards of European royalty's long history of colorful in-laws, an unusually stark mismatch. The strain came into painfully sharp focus in the spring of 2005. Caroline's father, Prince Rainier III, was dying. Then, the day before Rainier passed away, Ernst August fell into a coma after being hospitalized with acute pancreatitis. Caroline found herself grieving the father she'd grown especially close to after her mother's death, while simultaneously facing the possible loss of her husband. It was a brutal collision of fear and mourning, and in hindsight, many who followed the family closely point to that period as a real turning point in the marriage. Ernst August's health troubles didn't stop there. He would require emergency pancreatic surgery again in 2019, and his behavior never steadied. As the years wore on, Caroline rebuilt her life increasingly around Monaco, her children, and her cultural work, while her husband remained based largely in Germany and Austria. What had begun with royal approval, a pregnancy, and public hope was quietly hollowing out from the inside. By 2009, the separation had become an open secret. Caroline moved out of the couple's shared home, and after they sold their property in France, she returned to live full-time in Monaco. Any lingering ambiguity about the state of the marriage evaporated in January of 2010, when photographs surfaced showing Ernst August kissing another woman. Observers assumed a formal divorce would follow. It never did. More than 15 years on, Caroline and Ernst August remain legally married, even though their lives have run in completely separate directions for well over a decade. She lives in Monaco. He splits his time between Germany and Austria. In every practical sense, they are strangers to one another's daily lives. Yet in the eyes of the law, the marriage still stands. Whether that's a matter of Caroline's Catholic faith, a wish to avoid the spectacle of a public royal divorce, or simply personal preference, she has never fully explained. What's clear is that she still carries the title Princess of Hanover, even as she has, in every visible respect, lived as a devoted mother and Monaco's cultural anchor rather than as anyone's wife. Free from the daily instability of life beside him, Caroline watched from a distance as Ernst August's life kept sliding further into conflict. One of the most public struggles involved his own son. In 2004, he had transferred major family properties, including a historic castle, to his eldest son, Ernst August Jr. Years later, he tried to claw those properties back, launching a bitter legal battle against his own child over control of the family inheritance. The feud grew so severe that in 2017, he publicly opposed his son's marriage to Russian designer Ekaterina Malasheva and pointedly stayed away from the wedding entirely, a striking absence, especially since Caroline's own children from her marriage to Kasaragi, along with their half-sister Alexandra, all attended in his place. Then came the events at his hunting lodge in Austria, which turned a pattern of bad headlines into something far more alarming. In July 2020, according to police reports, Ernst August called for emergency help himself, saying he needed urgent assistance. When officers arrived, the situation reportedly turned dangerous. He became combative, allegedly threatened them with a knife, and struck an officer in the face before being restrained. Concerned he might harm himself, authorities took him to the psychiatric unit of a hospital in Wackelbruck, the very town where his and Caroline's daughter had been born 2 decades earlier. Less than 2 months later, in September, he was arrested again, this time accused of threatening an employee and her husband and damaging property at his estate. And Austrian court later handed him a suspended prison sentence along with a mandated course of psychotherapy for the July incident, and his lawyers pointed to isolation and the ongoing rift with his son as context for his unraveling behavior. Ernst August himself disputed the police account, insisting he had called for medical help and instead been mistreated. Taken together, the episodes paint the picture of a man in genuine crisis, a stark contrast to the composed, purposeful public life Caroline continued to lead in an entirely different world. for all the sorrow tangled up in her marriages, and all the turmoil attached to her estranged husband's name, Caroline herself has never lost her footing. She turned 69 in January of 2026 and remains one of the most respected figures in European royalty, known above all for her composure and her steady, private strength. Over the decades, she has become the cultural backbone of Monaco, carrying forward much of her mother's legacy. She serves as president of the Princess Grace Foundation, founded the Monte Carlo Ballet Company to fulfill a dream Grace Kelly never got to see through, chairs the Prince Pierre Foundation, and supports the Monte Carlo Philharmonic Orchestra. Since 2003, she has also served as a UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador, earning recognition for her advocacy work around children's welfare and the education of girls and women worldwide. Alongside all of that public work, she raised 4 children, Andrea, Charlotte, and Pierre Casiraghi, and Princess Alexandra of Hanover, largely as a single mother in practice, if not on paper. Her brother, Prince Albert, has repeatedly praised how she brought them up, and it's worth noting how close all 4 of her children have remained to one another despite having different fathers, and, in Alexandra's case, an absent one. Andrea has built a life partly out of the spotlight, focusing on business and philanthropic interests. Charlotte has carved out a public identity through publishing and animal welfare advocacy. Pierre has become one of the more visible younger Casiraghis, active in motorsport and increasingly in Monaco's public life. And Alexandra, the daughter she shares with Ernst August, has grown into adulthood largely shielded from her father's tabloid chapters, closer in practice to her Monegasque half-siblings than to the Hanover side of her family tree. Today, Caroline is a grandmother to 7 grandchildren, part of the next generation carrying the Grimaldi name forward, and she remains a familiar, elegant presence at Monaco's signature events, from the Rose Ball to the Grand Prix. Even now, her sense of style hasn't gone unnoticed. In 2020, Vogue named her among Europe's most stylish royals, a reminder that despite everything her family and her marriages put her through, the world still sees a woman who carries herself with the same composure her mother was famous for. It's a strange kind of ending, or rather, a story with no real ending at all. Caroline never divorced the man whose name filled Austrian police reports. She simply built a full, purposeful life around and apart from him, carrying the title Princess of Hanover the way she's carried so much else in her life, quietly, without complaint, and without ever letting the world see just how heavy the weight really was. Whether or not you believe in a Grimaldi curse, it's hard to look at Caroline's life and not see a woman who has spent 5 decades absorbing loss after loss and somehow, every time, finding her footing again.